I don't expect anybody to know, so I'm just going to give you an introduction to mushrooms and fungi as well. And so, first of all, mushrooms are fungi, and fungi are spore-producing heterotrophs, and they're composed usually of branch filamentous growth. Okay, I always mention heterotroph because a lot of people think of them as plants because they're rooted in one place, they don't go anywhere, they don't seem to eat. Okay, but they do eat. They eat by a process that we call absorption. Okay, and they produce spores, and we classify fungi according to the different types of spores they produce. And in the case, mushrooms usually produce basidial spores in a very, very strict sense of mushrooms. There are a lot of people that want to include fungi that produce acid ascospores as mushrooms too. That I'm going to include both, so that's no problem. Okay. And a spore is a reproductive structure. Okay. A lot of people say, well, that's a seed of some kind. It's not really a seed. Okay. A seed is multicellular, and it has an embryo in it. A spore is much more simpler as a reproductive structure than that. It's usually one cell, or sometimes it's a couple of cells. But there's no food storage, there's no embryo. And as you can see from the picture right here, they produce a filament in fungi. That filament is called the hypha, and there's a spore right there. Okay, so how does a fungus eat? Well, the process of absorption works like that picture up here. The fungus, because it's rooted in one place, it can't go anywhere. So in order for it to eat, it has to be able to have food nearby. And the way the fungus does it, it grows in its food, so it's living in its food. So imagine that this piece of hypha is surrounded by its food. So what it does is it secretes a digestive enzyme. And the enzyme will then start to break down the material around it. Usually it's specific for certain compounds. And then from there, the food is broken down into smaller organic compounds, which then can be taken through the cell wall of the fungus when it becomes broken. So it's digested first and then it's eaten. Okay, so just think about that. Okay, we eat our food, then we digest it. Okay, it's just the other way around here. Okay, here's an example. These strawberries, fungus is growing throughout its food and it's digesting it this way. Now, one thing I want to make clear is that one fungus will not be able to digest or eat up that whole strawberry. It works in a manner of succession. Different fungi, as well as bacteria, which are also decomposers, will go in there and then they will break down certain compounds. And then after that compound is used up, then the next group of organisms will come in and they will break down a bunch more until the whole strawberry is gone. So that's something that I want you to try to remember because Dr. Naylor also asked me to talk a little bit about cultivation of mushrooms, and that bit of information is going to be sort of important. Okay, so here's, again, another example. So you can see the fungus is growing out throughout its food. Actually, it was your food until it got hold of it. And you can notice it's a green color there. And that's because it's reproducing spores at the same time. And if you look at it under the microscope, you can see that these are the spores right here. And that's what the green is right here. This is a species of Mycelium. And of course, Mycelium is a very important fungus from which penicillin was first derived. Okay, now, how does this differ from a mushroom? Certainly mushrooms don't, produce spores like that. Okay, the big difference is that the mushroom will produce a very large structure in which spores are produced. That's the structure we call the mushroom. And generally, it's called a fruiting body. Okay, because that's where the reproductive structures are. If I can make this analogy, it's kind of like a fruit tree. Okay, you got like an apple is the fruit of the apple tree. In this case, the mushroom is like the fruit of the fungus, which is like the mycelium. Okay, so the mycelium is like equivalent to the tree, and the mushroom is like equivalent to the apple. Okay. But again, the mushroom doesn't produce seeds, it produces spores. spores, which are found in this case, on the gills of the mushroom, which you probably know. Okay, all of the hyphal growth in the mushroom is called the mycelium. And the other thing to notice here is that not only is the filamentous growth in the soil, but it also makes up the mushroom. What happens when it makes up the mushroom is it becomes tightly interwoven, and it looks just like a three-dimensional structure like we have, where the cells are dividing in 3 dimensions, which is not the case here. Okay, now originally I was just going to run through a whole bunch of mushrooms in Hawaii, but I cut it down because I had to get to the cultivation part of it. So I'm going to go through some mushrooms that are very common, some that are unusual, and some that I think are just kind of photogenic, so I threw them in there, and some have nice stories to them. And there's not going to be that many. But one of the things that I want to put to you right now is that if you're from the mainland, you probably around November, December, like in Oregon or in Northern California, there's tons of mushrooms. You can't go anywhere without even stepping on a mushroom when you go into a forest. And there's probably about 40, 50 species within a small area. You don't find that here in Hawaii. Can anybody guess why that's the case? Okay, it's not going to be, just a... I'm not really asking you because I'm not expecting you to know. The reason for it is that most mushrooms are associated with the roots of certain trees in a symbiotic relationship that we call the Mycorrhizae. Literally, that means a fungus root. Okay, and it's an obligate relationship in the case of mushrooms, as well as for the tree itself. And most of the trees involved are like conifers, like Douglas fir, pines, firs, and spruces, and those kinds of trees, which you don't see here in Hawaii. Okay, now we do have trees that are mycorrhizal. For the most part, it's eucalyptus. Okay, that's why we don't have so many species of mushrooms that are growing on the ground. Okay, here's one of the most common ones. You probably have seen this on campus. This is Chlorophyllum mollidites. It gets the name from the fact that when mature, the gills are green. Literally, chlorophyll means green leaf. And it's one that's kind of troublesome because I used to get, until they stopped funding the poison center in Hawaii, calls almost every month during the time when these things are out, because they want me to identify mushroom poisoning. And almost 90% of the time it will be this mushroom. However, it's not usually a fatal poison. Usually you're going to get sick for a couple of hours, and they can even release you about that after that time. In a couple of days, you'll probably feel fine. But in the meantime, you've got vomiting and diarrhea, like food poisoning. And another thing that's interesting is in an old area where it's been growing for a while, it forms a fairy ring in this particular species. Okay, so mushrooms are often divided into edible and non-edible. The edible ones, the poisonous ones are usually divided into different types of toxin. In the case of chlorophyllum, it's said to be a gastrointestinal irritant because the actual toxin has not been identified. So, nobody worries about it because, like I said, usually if somebody's eating it, they got sick, they can induce vomiting, and they're okay. And nobody usually dies from this, although in some cases you kind of wish you had. Okay, now here's one you might want to be a little bit more careful of. This is also very common. It's a mycorrhizal fungus. It's found associated with eucalyptus, so it's quite common. Fortunately, it's a little mushroom, and I'll explain later why it's good. But this particular species of Amanita belongs to a group or a section in the genus that has a deadly toxin, actually several deadly toxins in it, and it's inevitably fatal when eaten and not treated. Okay. And here's some more examples. This is Amanita phalloides in the same section of the genus. 94% of the fatality in mushroom poisoning throughout the world is from this species alone. Okay, this is another species, Amanita bisporigia, which is about the same size as the one that we have locally. Now, the reason I say it's good that it's small is that people seem to be attracted towards the big mushrooms. Whether they're edible or not, they figure that they look at something big and they say, this has got to be edible. And they eat it. And that's, and that's not one of the rules of thumbs that, you can go by. Okay, so, and another thing is that this one resembles an edible species of Amanita. There are a lot of edible species of Amanita as well. Unfortunately, most of it comes from mistaken identity in this case. So, fortunately, this thing is small, nobody pays any attention to it, nobody feels, well, this will make a good meal, because it won't, it's too small. Okay, this one I included because it's photogenic. It doesn't occur that commonly. I've seen it on Kokei, on Kauai, seen it at the Nature Conservancy on Molokai. It's only 2 places, but it's a nice looking mushroom, as you can see. Very commonly found on Christmas cards, and I'm sure you all recognize it. There's an interesting story about this mushroom, which I unfortunately don't have time to tell you, but I'll give you a real fast rundown on it. The species is actually associated with the origin of Christmas and Santa Claus. That's one side of the story. It's said that the tribes in Siberia have this shaman that goes around in a red coat with a red hat and a sack full of these mushrooms, taking it from house to house, giving it to people. And when it gets so snowed under they can't get access through the door, they go through the chimney. Okay, but what do the mushrooms do? Well, it turns out it contains ibultinic acid and mucimol, which gives everybody kind of a drunken feeling, like if you consumed a lot of alcohol. Now, one of the problems of the story is that they also associate hallucination, like reindeers flying, with this. Again, the origin of the flying reindeers. But there's a lot of holes in the story. I don't believe it, but there's whole books written about it. So I thought I'd just at least tell you about it. Okay, Psilocybes coprophylum. What do you think? Oh wow, we've got lots of psilocybes here. But one of the misconceptions is that they're all hallucinogenic. They're not. This one is not. This one is. This is not psilocybes. This is copolandia cyanicin. One of the telltale ways in which you can tell it is, so when you touch it, it bruises the blue color, like you see in the stalk right here. Okay, and the toxin in this case involved is psilocybin and psilocin, and there's variable types of symptoms. Uncontrollable laughter is the most common one. Euphoria is another one, and less commonly you get out-of-body experience and hallucination. So this is what is often attributed to Amanita muscaria, and that's not the case at all. It's Amanita muscaria. It's more like consuming too much alcohol. Okay, now some are edible. There's not a lot of good edible ones here. This is one of them. Volvaria ellis volvacea is the paddy straw mushroom. It's not as common as it used to be. When we had a very high-profile sugar plantation industry here, the sugar cane decals would be piled up, and these things would come out of these things in abundance, but now we don't see them as commonly. You still see them on compost piles and organic gardens and so forth, so it's not as common as it used to be, but it's a very good edible species and one that is commercially cultivated in a number of Asian countries. Okay, this one is Lepiota. That's another large species that people would be tempted to eat. And to be honest with you, I don't know whether this is edible or not. You look up the edibility on it, it says unknown. And you're thinking, well, geez, why should it be unknown? Can't we just do some kind of chemical analysis and find the toxin? Well, you can, but suppose this is an unknown toxin. So, what I'm saying is, it might sound funny, but it is true. The only way that we've ever known whether a species is edible or whether it's poisonous is somebody ate it and said it was good and they didn't get sick, or they ate it, they got real sick, or somebody saw them ate it and they died. Okay, that's the only way we know. Okay, at that point, then we can say, okay, don't eat it, and then later on we can do an analysis and see what kind of a chemical was responsible for the symptoms of the death. Okay, here's probably the largest species found in Hawaii. This particular one is called Mccroskey Spectatus, and it really is quite spectacular. First time I saw it was in the early 1990s. One of the ag extension workers said, I've got a mushroom for you to identify. He came coming in here, he had a giant garbage bag, and the cluster that he had was about 3 inches across This one's, as you can see, measured, this is probably like a little bit more than 20. Actually, it was larger, but I tore part of it off so I can put this mature mushroom in front to show you how big the mushroom can get. And again, this is one that we're not sure. It's been described as edible in the literature, but it's also been described as poisonous in the literature. That's probably because somewhere along the way there was misidentifications. Okay, so one year there was, it's getting common here, one of the students, grad students in the department came up with this cluster and gave it to me, and I said, oh yeah, I told her right away what it was. And she said that, oh, she has a friend that's going to have a party and she's going to serve all, he's going to serve all these mushrooms. So I told her the story. And the next day she came back and, and I kind of assumed that they would not have had it, but they decided they were going to eat the mushrooms. Fortunately, nobody died, nobody got sick, they said it was great. But, it could have gone the other way. So, it's good to be a little careful when you do these things. Okay, here's one that's a pathogen. This is on a banana plant, parts of a banana plant. It also is a parasite on the taro, not tuber, but the bulb of the taro. So this is one that's going to be of some economic importance as well. Marasmi is inoderma. And this is not anything special. This is another example of a Mycorrhizae species, which is very common because it's associated with the eucalyptus here in Hawaii. And that's Cortinarius clelandii. And we can actually, in some cases, tell where they're from. This one is actually from New Zealand. A lot of the mushrooms that we have here have been accidentally introduced, or, well, at least I'm pretty sure they were accidentally introduced from New Zealand or Australia. And I put this one in here just because it looks nice. But another thing is that not all mushrooms are going to have stalk, and you notice this one doesn't. The cap is attached right to the wood on which it's growing on. Okay, now, here's a different group of mushrooms. Now, you notice that this one has the cap, and it's got the stalk, and it even has the annulus, but there's no gills. Okay, this is a group called boletes, and you don't find these except when you get to the higher elevation, because these are Mycorrhizae, the pines. And the only way we're places where we usually have pine are in these higher elevations, such as Haleakala National Park, Volcanoes National Park, or Kokei, in those areas. So this is very common there. And you take a closer look, that's what those pores looks like. It's inside the pores that the spores will be born. And there's a number of species of these. Here's another one. These are often called the slippery jacks because of the very slimy nature of the cap. And you think a lot of people would be put off eating this, but a lot of people actually like eating these things. When I was a grad student working on my master's at San Francisco State, a lot of the grad students started eating these things. And they said, oh yeah, these are fine, just peel off the cap and get rid of that slime. It's really quite tasty. Okay, here's one that you might be interested in. This is an invasive species. It's been getting quite prominent throughout the South Pacific, and it's recently come into Hawaii, and it's getting to be very, very common because it just seems to really do well. And it's probably the only species I know that's been listed as being invasive. This is Fabolachia calacera. And you can see it's a very, very attractive looking invasive species, which I guess a lot of them are, regardless of what they're doing. And here's another one. This is a group called the bracket fungi, because they grow right out of the substrate, kind of like a bracket. This is Microporus flaviformis. It's got the nice kind of attractive color. A couple of years ago, I was on a radio show, and they didn't tell me who was going to be there. And I met somebody that was quite interesting. She takes these bracket fungi, and she makes jewelry out of it. And this is a picture I took when I was in Martin and MacArthur in Manoa. These things are quite expensive for what they are. You're paying for fungus here. Okay, but these are different than the mushroom. They're not fleshy, they're leathery in consistency, so they'll last a while. So they don't rot away like, if you use mushrooms. Okay, here's another one that has got a different consistency. This is Ganoderma australis. This is woody in its texture. And it's also unusual and it's perennial. Okay, each year it will grow this white layer, and underneath it's white too, where all the spores are born. And then when this layer dies, the next year another one will form. That's why if you look closely, you can see there are kind of rings around it, and they can get quite big. In the Guinness Book of World Records, there's one species that's listed that weighs 385 pounds because it was so old when it was discovered. But this species is also commonly called the artist fungus. This is from a collection that was made in 2011 when I led the American Phytopathological Society on a foray up in Manoa Falls. And some other people decided they were going to do something with this. So they drew some pictures, and when you dry it, these things are permanent. Okay, and if it gets wet again, you can mess it up. But if you paint it in some kind of varnish to seal it, it's permanent. And you can buy actually artwork done with dermal species on the internet, and they're quite good. Take a look, Google it sometimes. You'll see there's some quite attractive artwork being done with these. Okay, another group are commonly called the coral fungi. This is not a very good picture. This is Remediation. This is, again, Mycorrhizae with eucalyptus, so it's not that uncommon. But one that looks a lot better is this one right here, Ramaria fragilema, which is also associated with eucalyptus as well. Okay, now, one group that I worked a lot with are what the company called the jelly fungi. And it's called that because of the consistency of the fruiting body. This is Tremella borensis, probably one of the most common species here. You might think it's a wood rotter, but it's not. Actually, it's growing on the mycelium of a wood rotter, and it's actually a parasite on another fungus. Until that was discovered, this species right here, it was impossible to cultivate. It was collected for 1,000 years as not only for food, but as a herbal. And when it was finally discovered it was a parasite, they were finally able to grow the fungus that was parasitic on, and now we get it commercially, and it's a lot cheaper. But this is found fairly common here in Hawaii. And of course, the most common one is this one right here, Uricularia cornea, which is even has a local name, Papayas. Okay, and it's one of the only species that I recall fungus that people actually eat locally. Okay, and this is also commercially grown in various Asian countries as well. So it's very popular. Okay, now we go to a group that are commonly called the puffballs. Okay, this is Geastrum indicum, and literally that means earth scarred. You can see why that would have that name. Here's the immature puffball. When it starts to mature, it splits stellately to form the star-shaped outer layer that you see here. Okay, the inner one is a ball shape as well, and it's very pliable, and it contains all the spores. So when a raindrop, a piece of water, like from a raindrop or when a rodent or something comes by and bumps it, it causes the inner part of this ball to become depressed, and it puffs out the spores through this opening right here. Like you see, these are the spores that have puffed out. Okay. Okay, here's another interesting, now not all puffballs will puff their spores like that. Puffballs have actually evolved a different number of mechanisms by which they disperse their spores, and this is probably one of the most interesting ones. Okay, this one is Aceroi rubra, very common, again it's mycorrhizae with eucalyptus, and this area right here that's very slimy, that's where the spores are. And that's what is also responsible for the common name of this group called the stinkhorns. Very bad odor. Here's another example that's sort of also as common, Phallus rubicundus. This is very, very slimy and it smells very bad. Within a matter of hours, flies will be attracted to it, it will eat up all of the spores, and there'll be nothing left of this. Okay, so you can imagine what it must smell like if it attracts that much, that many spores. So this is an example of fly dispersal. Okay, this is the two species that I commonly called, in my name, not anybody else's, desert puffballs. Okay, because they're found in a very, very dry area, kind of behind the beaches, under the kiawe tree where they're root parasites. And you can tell by looking at it, it probably has a woody texture, and you'd be right. This is very woody, but it's not wood. This is, again, made up of interwoven mycelium. And the ball is where all the spores are. You can see there are holes in it. It's not from insects. That's the way it naturally is. And that's how the spores are released slowly through these openings. Now, the one next to it is Botany phalloides, which has a different mechanism. It has the same shape, but there's a predetermined dehiscent site right underneath right here. And you can see where it's broken away. And here's where the whole thing has come off. So it exposes the entire spore mass all at one time, and then it gets blown away by the wind and dispersed. Okay, these are not as common. And then we're back to what looks more like a typical puffball. See, in this case, you notice there's no opening anywhere. Okay, in this case, the entire fruit body is usually carried away by some mammal that will utilize it for food. Okay, and usually these are not the kind of mammals that'll eat right there. Maybe they'll be squirrels. They'll carry it away someplace and store it where they can go back and get it later. In some cases, they forget. So this is a rhizopogon. Again, if you notice, there are pine needles all over the place, so we only find it where there's pines. So it's not something that's going to be that common unless you go up to higher elevations. Okay, now this one is very, very common. It's Mycorrhizae with eucalyptus. This unattractive looking thing, this is what it looks like when you cut it open, is Pysolyssus tinctorius. And this is unusual because these little packets in here, that's where all the spores are mature. It's not like there's a whole area where this is made up only of spores. They're divided into these discrete units in here that contain the spores. And this is an important species. Usually, when they transplant trees or they introduce plants to trees to foreign areas, they need to have the mycorrhizal fungus growing with it so the tree can grow. So this is one of the ones that they commonly introduce, and this is why we have it so commonly in Hawaii, because this has been used to establish a number of eucalyptus species. Okay, now the next couple are not going to be in the strict sense mushrooms, but they produce large fruiting bodies like you see here. This is Sorrel Cyclone, Nasal. This is the group that was in the Ascus ascospore group, which is actually still closely related to mushrooms, but they're not mushrooms in the strict sense. Okay, I found this particular collection on Coquet a number of years ago, and I thought I had identified it as Sorrel Cyclone coccinea, and I was confident it was right, and I sent it to Cornell, where there was a graduate student that was working on it for a PhD. And she said, no, you're absolutely wrong. How can you think that? What's the matter with you? And she said, this is a new species. So she named it Mycelium. I don't really quite know what that means, but there must be some descriptive reason for that. Okay, there is one species of Morella. I don't know if anybody knows what a Morella is here. This is Morella esculenta. This is the only genus where all the species are edible and very desirable. Okay, the species cannot be cultivated. So normally what happens is people go out, because there are flushes during the springtime when they're after a fire, especially in an area where there's a fire, and you can collect buckets and buckets of them. And I've seen them in the stores in California for anywhere from $30 to $40 a pound. So they're quite expensive. But, okay, this is not in Hawaii. Don't want to get to you. I thought I'd include this one just to make a comparison. This is the truffle. Probably you all have heard about truffles. Okay, this is the genus tuber. This is tuber melanosporum, black truffle. And this one, depending on market value, but at least the last one that I looked at, it can range between $1,000 and $3,000 a pound. Okay, and you can think right away, now, is there any meal that's worth that much, especially when the fungus part of it is going to be that expensive? I had my first meal with a truffle 2 years ago, because before I kind of figured it was just too expensive. So I took a lady friend of mine on her preferred birthday to Chef Marvel down in Uricularia Street. And for $27, a mere $27, they can take it's kind of a razor, and they can shave off little pieces of this thing and put it on top of the mushroom, on the rest of the food, and it's $27. And the end of the night when I got the bill, it was $500-something without the tip. Let me tell you, that was the last time I went there. So yeah, these meals get so expensive, but I think that, even without the truffle, it would have been an expensive meal. So I don't want to blame it all on that. Okay, so these are some of the very, very common, unusual, or mushrooms with interesting stories. And there's a lot more, but like I said, there's not nearly as many species here as there is in the mainland for the reasons I gave you, because of the lack of mycorrhizal trees. The ones that you see are mostly field mushrooms. They're litter decomposers, or they're wood decomposers like the bracket fungi I showed you. Okay? Okay, now this is the part that Dr. Daler asked me to do for mushroom cultivation related to what we can do locally for, I guess, sustainability or something. Okay, so basically there are two mushroom cultivation methods. There's the compost method, because a lot of mushrooms are decomposers, and they have their place in the ecosystem where they will come in at certain times and decompose certain compounds. In this case, we're talking usually about hemicellulose, lignin, and cellulose. Okay? And they are part of the succession in decomposition. So that's why I wanted to make sure you understood about absorption in fungi. The other type is the wood decomposers, where they are wood rotters. And you grow them on cut logs, or more recently, on sterilized sawdust that has an added carbohydrate source. Let's go over these, I'll go over them kind of quickly. It's kind of a difficult process to really understand. And I'm not exaggerating this. Over the years since I've been at this university, I've had literally hundreds of people have come to me and said, I want to grow mushrooms commercially, because there's very few people that do that here. And when I tell them what you need to do, they just kind of give up and they leave. But there are 3 people that did not give up. One of them now is stationed in Manoa. He has a webpage called Small Kind Mushroom, and he grows Portobello mushroom. He does it quite successfully. He had 2 grants in which he worked out his methods, and I helped him as his consultant. And there's a grad student from NREM who also now is starting growing something a little bit more simpler. She's growing the Papayas, and she has, I'm quite happy with her success, because she started with absolutely no knowledge of growing. She just decided one day when she took the magical mushroom course that she wanted to do this. And today she's a grad student in NRAM. Okay, so the example we're going to use for the compost is Agaricus bisporus, the supermarket mushroom. Okay, so what you need to start off from raw materials, you need hay, lots and lots of hay. You need horse manure, and usually chicken manure as well. I don't know why that is as important, but I usually have seen mostly horse manure. And gypsum is also something that's important, although I'm not sure why, because that's included in the recipe. And what you do is you water it down and you let the decomposition start taking place, because that's what composting is. You throw out a lot of food and other organic material, and you let the bacterial organisms start to break it down, and eventually it comes to the point where you can utilize it as fertilizer for your garden. Okay, and this is kind of almost the same thing when you're trying to grow mushrooms. So as the temperature grows up, you water it, you turn it, and you do that so it maintains aerobic condition. That is oxygen. There's no anaerobic bacteria that's going to grow from it. And it can go as high as 80 degrees Celsius, which is quite hot. Okay, so that's natural biological activity. And then when it's finally done, it's going to be dark brown and it's going to reek of ammonia. Okay, and this is what it looks like, a pilot, and this is mass production, you have to understand. Okay, then they put it in these trays where the mushrooms will eventually be grown. Okay, it's here that they're going to pasteurize it at 66 degrees, because when you use the hay, there's all kinds of junk that's in there. There's insects, there's nematodes, there's unwanted bacteria and fungi that are infecting all of this stuff. By pasteurizing it, you get rid of just about all of it. And you leave the good bacteria that are going to be important in helping the breakdown or the succession of the compost. Okay, and at the same time, the surviving bacteria is going to break down the ammonia, the protein, which you have to, because ammonia is going to be really bad for the mushroom when it's growing. Okay, by this time, the temperature has been lowered to 24 degrees Celsius, and now you're ready to inoculate the mycelium. Okay, now how do you do this? Okay, you develop what's known as spawn. And spawn is a lot of mycelium. You want a lot of mycelium to spread it out as much as you can in those trays. Okay, so what you do is you may start it off like from spores like this, and you put like some kind of grain, like in this case it's rye. You sterilize rye and you inoculate it. And then you have a lot of rye, and you can shake it all up and break it into pieces, and you pour it all through the top of the compost, and you get somebody with well, they got machines to do it now, but they used to get somebody with, just moving all that compost around to get the spawn all throughout the entire compost area. Okay, and if you don't want to do that, you can just buy it from the store. Here it is, they usually grow it on wheat berry. Here's the uninoculated. What they do is they have these polypropylene bags, they sterilize the grain in there, and they inoculate it. You can see that this is white from the mycelium, from the mushroom spawn, from the agaricus. Okay. Okay, so here it is. The compost has now got the spawn is now grown throughout the entire compost. But it's not going to give rise to mushroom. There's one more step that has to be added before that's going to happen. You're going to have to put what's known as a casing layer over it that's made up usually of peat and limestone. And it's going to be about an inch and a half to 2 inches thick that covers the top. Okay, it's in this casing layer that there's going to be a transition from the vegetative state to the mushroom state, that is the reproductive state. Okay, the mushrooms won't form without the casing layer. So if you look at it a little bit later, you can see there's little white dots here. This is what's known as pinning. These little dots are the young mushroom primordia. And here's a close look at it. See these white areas right here? That's the young mushrooms forming. And then 18 to 21 days after casing, you can see there's a whole bunch of mushrooms in here. Okay, and this is when they're collected and taken to the store. Now, you just don't throw it out after that. After you picked it, you can usually pick it 3 to 5 days later, and you can get just as many mushrooms. And you can do that several times. But eventually, it's going to not give as many mushrooms, and it's going to reach a point where they're going to say, well, it's no longer economically feasible. So they throw the whole thing out, and then they start over again. Okay. Now, one thing you notice about this, you probably don't know this. This is a white button mushroom. Okay. Oh, let me show you. This shows you the different layers. Okay. Here's the compost. Here's the black is where the casing is, and here's the mushrooms growing on top. Okay. You may not be aware of this, but there's two varieties of the agaricus spores, the crimini and the Portobello. And I don't know if you buy the Portobello, but the Portobello is probably about twice as much as the crimini and the white button mushrooms. They're the same species. The only difference is that they let the Portobello grow and mature entirely, whereas they usually stop and pick them at this stage in the button mushrooms, because they're button stage, and that's when they're picked. So it's kind of it's kind of a ploy to me that they do that. Okay, so that's how the composting method works. Okay, the example I'm going to use for the there's the Lentinella spinodes, which is the Shiitake, and this applies to other wood-inhabiting fungi as well. Okay, now instead of getting spawn the usual way that I showed you, they get wooden dolls like this. They sterilize it in plastic bags, then they inoculate the dolls with the mycelium of the Shiitake. Okay, So that's the source of the inoculum. Okay, now there's two methods. One's by cut logs, and the other's by sawdust and sterilized polypropylene bags. Okay, this is the old method, and it's still used quite a bit. They cut logs to a certain size, like the size right here. And they take a drill, and they drill a hole that's approximately the diameter of the wooden dowel. And then they put the wooden dowel in here, and they usually use a mallet to hammer in there to get it a tight fit. And once you've done that, you take some hot wax on a brush, and you brush over that area to seal it so that there's no contamination that will occur. And after you get that done, 6 to 18 months later, you're going to get mushrooms, which is a long time to wait, I think. Okay, but eventually you do get mushrooms, and they'll last for I don't know how long. You can pick mushrooms and keep picking them for quite a while in this method. But the problem is that you can imagine you make tons of mushrooms every year, and you're cutting these logs. You're really endangering the species from which you're using, and that's what happened in Japan. It was the species of oak that was being used, and pretty soon they were running out of the trees. So, fortunately, they came up with a new idea of using polypropylene bags filled with sawdust. Okay, so you can use waste wood material, put them in these bags, and then sterilize it, with a carbohydrate source. And this little tag right here, that allows you to open it up and inoculate the fungus. In this case, you don't need to have the dowel. You can just use the grains as you did in the supermarket mushroom. But this is a really neat technique. And here it is, after it's been sterilized and it's grown, and you've got a bunch of shiitake coming out of here. Now, the advantage of this is that, first of all, it shortens the time of fruiting. It only takes about 2 months from the time you inoculate until you start getting mushrooms. So you got right away a benefit. And you also, it's more conservation minded, because you're not impacting the environment as much. You're taking waste sawdust and using that to grow the mushrooms with. Okay, and technique works pretty well. I've used it myself. When I first started my job here, I had a research program working with the Papayas, and this is grown on sugarcane bagasse with road oats, and you can see it does quite well. I did a little project when I found this particular one. It's an albino species, and when I crossed it with the F1 generation, I didn't do it really, in great detail, but I grew 10 crosses, and they all were, pigmented like that. And then I went to the F2 generation, and again, I did a self-cross, and I did 10 more crosses, and some of them came out white like this. So it seems like, I don't have enough evidence to show this, but it seems like it's one of these traits that's dominant recessive, because the albino form didn't show up until the F2 generation. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting project that I just, quit doing because of the time that was needed to do any kind of research with these crosses and fruiting studies. Okay, so that's mushrooms of Hawaii, some interesting stories, some interesting species, as well as the cultivation and an interesting results from the Uricularia studies.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
Number 1, a lot of species in Hawaii we've talked about so far of other animals and other plants have a big invasive impact from like the rot here. Is that similar to in mushrooms?
That hasn't happened yet, because usually the species that they're trying to grow, they're temperate species. And if they get out, they usually don't make it. Okay, so yeah, there's the Hamakua mushroom. It's quite extensive, but I haven't seen any new species of oyster mushrooms they introduced or anything like that.
And my second question is, what is the symbiotic relationship with trees and fungus commonly, and that's why I like say a lot of the
Excuse me, one thing I should mention, I don't hear too well.
Oh, the symbiotic relationship between the trees and the mushrooms, you said that a lot don't grow here because of it. What do the trees get and what do the mushrooms get from that relationship?
What the mushroom gets, they get the carbon source from the tree. But it's it's not a parasitic relationship, because the carbohydrate they get, the tree doesn't utilize that anyway. It's like it's made for the fungus. Okay, now, the fungus in turn, because of the extensive mycelium throughout the soil, they enhance the nutrient uptake to the tree. Like as much as 65% more with it because of the, and also it also enhances the water uptake as well. So in some cases, like I said, it's something that's obligate in the case of trees. But some of the other plants, like some agricultural things, it's not obligate. It's only something that a relationship will form when the plant actually needs to have the relationship. So this is a specific example I'm talking about here. Yes?
You said that that it was actually the same species, right, of button mushroom and portobello. It's different nutritional value at different stages.
Yes.
So different as far as the
Well,
eat, but it's those same species.
I'll be honest with you. I've eaten a lot of different species of mushroom. And I'm not a connoisseur. I have to admit, I'm not a connoisseur of good food, and to me, most of them taste pretty much the same. Okay, so those three varieties will all taste the same to me, as far as I'm concerned.
I had a second question. The mushrooms grown on the logs versus the sawdust, is that the same? Is there, even though it's the same variety, same species, is there much of a difference in the nutritional value? I heard some people that grow them on logs kind of say, oh, these are way better for you because they're grown naturally on logs instead of like artificial sawdust stuff, but they're the same species.
I don't know why sawdust would be artificial. The composition of sawdust would be more or less the same as the log.
Yeah,
Okay.
probably just people claiming.
Yeah, I mean, you do need to add a carbohydrate source because the sawdust does not contain some of the natural sugars that may still be left in the food transport tissue in the logs. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you.